Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, February 4th, 2026, and our new friend, Stanislav Krapivnik. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name
Oh, that's
correctly.
good. That's good.
So
Pretty
nice
good.
to have you on this podcast, Stas.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
I was on a podcast a couple days ago. The guy kept forgetting my name. So I was like, our fifth time he forgets my name. It's like, okay. you know, it happens, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah, it's so good to know you, to talk with you, Stas. And please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And let me start, Stas, with what's going on in Abu Dhabi, the trilateral meeting between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine. Where are we heading, in your opinion? Before going there, let's talk about the reality on the battlefield in Ukraine. The war somehow getting to Kiev, and Zelensky and his administration know what is the reality of the current situation in Ukraine. On the other hand, you see somehow Europeans are getting somehow radical toward the conflict. They don't want to back down. They don't want to see the reality. And how do you see the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, instead of going too much into detail, because that could take an entire hour. Watch the battlefield. I've been doing that a couple times the last week, 2 weeks. The reality is, and we see this in different locations, flat out, the Ukrainians are running thin. They're running very thin. As a quick example, judge them by the size of their quote counter attacks or their offensives. In 22, we had a big offensive in Kharkov, which, by the way, destroyed the Ukrainian Iron Fist, the tanks that they were massing in Kharkov, hiding them in under residential buildings and parking lots. When they went out in combat, they took a lot of heavy loss, but they don't talk about that. They just talk about that they were able to push the Russian army out, which was very thinly spread at that point up in Kharkov. Then Kherson, which, by the way, the Russian army stepped back out of Kherson city, and the Ukrainians came in 3 days later. They're afraid they were going to get ambushed. They did get artillery ambushed once they came in within range. But these were relatively big offensives. Then we had the vaunted counteroffensive of 23, which is insane if you think about it, because this is like a bad the analogy I used for the 23 offensive was like a bad Van Damme movie. I'm going to take my right leg and I'm going to put it to your left ear. Stand here, wait 1 second. And they literally did what they said they were going to do. They attacked on the spot they said they were going to do, and everything. It's like nobody does that. Actually, you may tell your opponent, "I'm going here, but I'm going to go over here, and then over here, and over here, over here." Yeah, it's called surprise, element of surprise. No element of surprise. We're going to start more or less on the same date that we said we're going to, and it had the It had the results of 85,000 dead from the Ukrainian side. I don't know how many wounded. They left a lot of their wounded to die. Well, at first they used them as artillery targets, artillery traps. So when the Russian soldiers came out to get them, pick them up, the wounded, they just start firing artillery at them. They just, after a while, they just let them rot, die in place and rot. And nobody's going to get them. And this was and they, for that price, took a field of 120 square kilometers, 12 by 10, which is a tiny little box. That's World War I casualties. Then that was 23. 24, we had the Kharkov counteroffensive or the offensive. And regardless of how much the news blew up about in the West and the maps showing these giant locations, the reality is they were able to penetrate into southeastern Kursk Oblast, and they took southeastern Kursk, which is about 12-13% of the oblast. It's not a small oblast to begin with, but it's not huge. But they only took about 13%, one real big town in there, and a bunch of small villages in the middle of the woods. So that was 24. 25, Kupinsk. And what you notice is each time is they're getting much, much, much smaller. They're running out of men and equipment. They're still doing these PR stunts. I think this is the first war in history where one side is fighting not so much for strategical and tactical victories as in PR victories. You got to get the title up there. The Ukrainian army broke through here. Then they all got killed 10 minutes later. Doesn't matter because we just have the picture of them holding a flag. And they've literally done these, by the way. They would send basically suicide squads out. You got to get a picture of you on the border and some this building or this building so I can geolocate you inside. That you're going to get killed afterwards, and survive as you can afterwards, but get the picture. And they started doing that actually on the Russian border back in 23. And these guys would get shot up. The Russian border patrol would see them and open fire on them. And they're going out there putting border stumps on there, taking photos. You're like, geez, it's a waste of men, but it's a PR. It's all about PR. Well, even the PR can't cover up what's going on the battlefield right now. I've been saying this, Zaporozhye is the weakest part right now. The big fight is going on in Konstantinovka. The Russian forces that had taken Krasnoarmeysk and freed Dmitrov or Mirnograd are being refocused onto Konstantinovka. Ukrainians are throwing everything they have in Konstantinovka. The secondary big fight in that area is Krasny Liman, because once Krasny Liman is taken, and it's already partially invested, once Krasny Liman is taken, you're on the high ground overlooking Slavinsk. And if you can start cutting Slavinsk off, you're basically cutting off that whole agglomeration of Slavinsk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, which is the last built-up fortified area in the Donbass for the Ukrainians. The Russians are pushing slowly toward Dobropolye, Donetsk Dobropolye. There's a Dobropolye in Zaporozhye too. That's a little bit of a confusing thing because a lot of these city names they repeat or they have modifications to them. It's like Dobropolye, it's Dobroskaya Polye, or something like that. So if for people who aren't paying attention, they'll start getting confused with it because the same names keep popping up or something similar. But the big thing, I think, is the big breakthrough is going in Zaporozhye because this is a front from edge to edge from Gulay-Polye. Well, the Russian army is actually about 20 kilometers west of Gulay-Polye at this point. Not 20 kilometers, 2 kilometers west of Gulay-Polye, maybe 3, and they're pushing their way out. And the Ukrainians are just throwing everything they can into it. If you actually look at the Ukrainian maps, they haven't updated them in 3 months. So Russia hasn't even reached Gulay-Polye as far as their maps show. But the reality is, it's west of Gulay-Polye, and about 25, 26 kilometers from Oryokhovo. But Oryokhovo has been invested from the south by 2 columns, and there's a column moving from the west to hit Oryokhovo. That's about 7 kilometers, 8 kilometers out. So it's being pushed through in different areas. And this is your last fortified major town. Well, and again, it's one of these towns. If anybody has been in America or modern big Russian cities, you have urban sprawl because you got a lot of land. And this is kind of the same, except that urban sprawl is mostly up and down 2 major highways. So you got Oryokhovo in the middle, and you got urban sprawl of these little neighboring towns that kind of bleed into each other. And that's where this kind of fortification line becomes in that area. But that's it. After that, it's pretty much open fields. They're trying to dig field fortifications in the open. They don't have manpower for them. And basically that area is where I think everything's going to collapse fast. The Russian troops have already taken the crossing across estuary 11 kilometers south of Zaporozhye itself. And Zaporozhye sits in the northwestern corner of the Zaporozhye province. So they've got, from that point, on a straight line, they've got 11 kilometers to Zaporozhye city itself. So for the Americans, it's 6.6 miles. Not exactly a very far, very big distance. So the Ukrainians, the only thing that's saving the Ukrainians is the weather, and because it's not cold enough. The temperatures there are ranging from low plus to about -10, and sometimes, and the problem is, as we were talking, Nima, even at -13, I've got a dark colored car, and the snow under the sun at -13 was melting. In fact, I was driving by a big pile of there's road construction, big pile of dirt and clay that had been dug up that hasn't been removed yet, and it was steaming. It's minus 13 outside, bright sunlight, and it's steaming because there's some wood chips and everything else in there that's decaying, and B, it's the sun heating the ground, right? And it's minus 13 outside. You wouldn't think, oh, it's got to be solid, but it's already steaming, which means it's already defrosting. And that becomes a big problem when you have tanks and heavy equipment going over in these open fields, is they're waterlogged, and the water's starting to turn, the ice is turning into water under sunlight, even though it's freezing temperatures outside. Yeah, sure, at night it'll refreeze, but that kind of becomes a difficult point for with heavy equipment. And then once the unfreeze hits and everything floods out, until all that drains out, you'll have about a month, which is a month of very limited movement, because you can't go through that black earth. It's like going through. Oh, good Lord! If you've never been through black earth, it will suck. It just won't suck the boots off. It'll suck the socks off. It might suck the skin off your bones. I mean, it is just like it's not even like clay. It's like quicksand. Worse, probably even that. It's such a consistency. So it's very difficult to move through that. And vehicles just churn everything up to where you're literally swimming in it. And then, historically speaking, once heavy equipment came into play, it's one thing on horses. It's even much harder if your horses are pulling wagons. But when you get into heavy vehicles going over something like this, it just, they just sink. I mean, it's flat out. They'll just bottom out, and then you wait till everything dries and start digging them out. So that's buying the Ukrainians some amount of time, because the Russian forces can't move as fast and as hard in that area. But it's still the weakest sector, because they simply don't have the manpower. They don't have prepared positions. The prepared positions they had are all overrun in the south and in the east. And unlike the Donbass, where they were pouring cement for 8 years and preparing these positions, there's a lot fewer towns in Zaporozhye, so you don't have this endless agglomeration of suburbia and towns and villages bleeding into each other. And they didn't have 8 years to do anything. They had about a year and a half to do field fortifications. And they did a very poor job of those overall. So they had, while Gulai-Polya held, they more or less held that line. But the moment Gulai-Polya went, that was it. The eastern flank is gone. The western flank's already been flanked. So now you've got whatever forces in the middle that are steadily being squeezed together around Oryokhov. And once that territory is taken and in-depth lines of communication secured, you've got 11 kilometers to Zaporozhye. So I think that's the big. If Zaporozhye falls, not if, but when, that opens up all of central Ukraine in many different directions. And that becomes a nightmare scenario for the Ukrainians, because they can't defend in every direction that they could get attacked in. So,
yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, we know that on the part of the NATO, there are people in the United States talking about providing Ukraine with, like Lindsey Graham, with Tomahawk missiles. Do you see anything at this particular moment, at this stage of war in Ukraine, that the West can provide anything to Ukraine to somehow, to change the game, or somehow bring some sort of leverage to Ukraine, to the position of Ukraine? What else? What can they do? Is that possible for the current situation in Ukraine, considering their army, considering the manpower they have, considering the support they're receiving from the West, from NATO? What else NATO can do for them that they haven't done before?
Well, the U.S. military can take its entire effective ground force, plus the Marine Corps, which would be about 450,000 troops, and toss them on the battlefield, and then swallow the mass casualties that will happen afterwards. Well, they could do that. All of NATO in Europe can pretty much just suck up all of its combative capable soldiers, and it'll probably come up to a little less than what the U.S. can do by itself, and throw all that on the battlefield and suck up the mass casualties. I mean, there are a lot of dead Europeans, and there are a lot of dead Americans. They don't want to talk about it. And Lindsey Graham definitely doesn't want to talk about it. That little Epstein wannabe ghoul. He, went, oh, there are no Americans now. Oh yeah, there are, and not a few. By the way, those HIMARS going boom, those are Americans behind the wheel. The Patriots going boom. A Patriot battery is 94 people if it's a full strength. That's a Patriot battery. That's mechanics, operators, commanders, and everybody. 94 people. And those aren't Ukrainians. They didn't get that many Patriot crew up to speed. Base course to prepare a Patriot mechanics like 54 weeks. Officers are half a year. Operators are a bit less. But that's a long time. Most of those Patriot batteries, when the Germans go, oh, we gave them 2 Patriot batteries. Well, guess who's sitting behind those Patriot batteries? Those are Germans. And when those Patriot systems get whacked, those are Germans burning in those vehicles, or Americans burning those vehicles, or the Brits, or the Poles. They're not Ukrainians. So there's plenty of people from Europe that have gone to meet Saint Bandera. The Poles have taken somewhere around 10,000 casualties, and that's because they were rotating battalion to get them combat experience. But you get combat experience by being in combat. When you get in combat, you start taking casualties. That's kind of the way the game plays. Novorisk seems to have backed off from that somewhat, which is good. But then again, some of the things coming out of his mouth makes you wonder. When the guy says he talks to Pilsudski every day, the guy that's been dead for the last 90 years, it's starting to make you wonder a few things, and other statements he's made. But why Poland can't get a normal leader in 30 years? There are normal people like Brown, but they keep electing people that are whacked in one way or the other. I don't know why. But there's outside of that, the problem with a Tomahawk, first of all, a Tomahawk would be strictly Americans firing it. I mean, let's be honest. I'll tell you another one. The HIMARS are strictly Americans firing. It's not Ukrainians firing HIMARS. From end to end, that is Americans. And I've been saying this for 3 years now, that those are Americans. Those are Americans in the vehicles. Those are Americans picking out targets. Those are Americans that are in the vehicles launching those missiles. They're American systems guiding those missiles. So when those missiles also hit civilian targets and kill women and children, those are American military killing Russian civilians. I don't know how else to put it. And thank you, New York Times. In December of 24, the New York Times confirmed all of it, including the fact that the ATACMS missiles were not a request from the Ukrainians. That was a demand from U.S. generals that are running the war. New York Times, the mouthpiece of the CIA, they just spilled the beans on everything. Thank you for confirming what I was saying for 2 years before that. It's nice to be, to be confirmed, because even on Russian television, people were looking at me like I was a little, off there. I'm like, no, those are Americans. Don't say those are Ukrainians fired. They weren't Ukrainians fired. They were maybe under Ukrainian organization, but they don't answer to Ukrainians. Those are controlled by Americans. So yeah, that's like it or not, but that's how that cookie crumbles. So outside of putting a lot of Europeans and Americans in the crosshairs to be killed in this war, there's pretty much nothing they can actually do. Now, the problem with Tomahawks is not only would those be Americans, but a Tomahawk is a nuclear-capable missile. So if there's Tomahawks flying toward Moscow, the only way you tell it's a nuclear-capable missile is whether when it blows up and you figure out what the warhead is, or if you shoot it down and you go look at the warhead. Either way, you've got to consider the fact, especially from the U.S. that has a first strike policy and has attempted to behead Iran, has with the Israelis try to behead Hezbollah, Hamas, has pulled these same types of stunts on Yugoslavia when they tried to kill Milosevic. People don't remember that, but they did. They blew up his house, killed part of his family. They've done this numerous times, and all under the guise, including in Yugoslavia and other places, all under the guise of negotiations. The U.S. is not exactly a trustable partner there, if you can call them a partner. So if there's a missile heading toward Moscow and it's a Tomahawk missile, you have to consider that this is a nuclear-tipped missile trying to do a decapitation strike. And what's the logical response? Full salvo nuclear strike back on the U.S. and Europe, wipe out. And then we've got nuclear Armageddon. So do you want to give that kind of power to Satanists sitting in Kiev? And again, you got Satanists sitting in Washington. So I don't know how big the difference is. Yeah, Epstein's files opens up a lot of things on a lot of people these days. So, so I don't know. I don't think there is anything they can do short of declaring war and just throwing everything they have in the kitchen sink.
I think, Stas, what we had in Ukraine, what we have in Ukraine is something, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States has never experienced, a real war. They had in Iraq, Afghanistan, they were dominant. They didn't have even the military to confront the United States. This is the first time they're fighting in Ukraine. Not just the United States, all of NATO, all NATO countries are fighting Russia in Ukraine. I think you've mentioned how Americans were involved in Ukraine, how the Europeans were involved. All together were somehow defeated by the Russian army. And how do you see the way that the Russian army, before starting the war in Ukraine, what we had about our assessment, to talk with every military expert in the West, even in the alternative media, they were assessing the Russian army as a defensive force. Today's reality of the Russian army is totally different. They have been transforming for more than 4 years. Now we are getting to the 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine somehow, and it shows how the army has been changing and has been the experience they have, they had during, all along the conflict in Ukraine. How do you assess the Russian army today? The Russian army today compared to what it was before the conflict started, a defensive force right now, I would say the most experienced army on this planet as time goes by.
Well, there are several things that need to be considered. First of all, in the case of the Americans, Korea was the last real war the U.S. military fought and took a lot of casualties. I won't consider Vietnam because Vietnam was a guerrilla warfare first and foremost, though South Vietnam fell to a combined arms assault from North Vietnam. It didn't fall to the Viet Cong. Viet Cong pretty much ceased to exist after the Tet Offensive. And the North Vietnamese pushed them into that Tet Offensive to get rid of them because they didn't want political competition when the war was over. As far as Russia, well, first of all, Russia had combat experience in Chechnya 1, Chechnya 2. Chechnya 2 was 1999. So this is 20 years. But for at least a lot of senior commanders and senior NCOs, they had seen combat before firsthand in those areas. So they weren't green. And this was not combat like what America fought in Afghanistan or in Iraq. This was, because the American approach, I mean, the standard operating procedure is if you start receiving sniper fire, you return fire in a general direction because it's pretty hard to tell exactly where the sniper fire comes from. You should look at your buddy's, which direction his brain or blood splatter was, and you kind of figure out what direction the bullet came from, and you just put down fire in that area, and then you break contact, and then you call in artillery or aviation to just wipe out the building that fire may have been coming from, and screw whoever's living in that building. It's their problem, not your problem. That's the standard approach. When the Russian army was fighting much closer and much harder in Chechnya 1 and 2, and more or less particularly Chechnya 2, trying to preserve the civilians. Though most of the civilians were evacuated out of Grozny by that point. Well, that's one. So at least a lot of the senior leadership had hands-on experience in house-to-house fighting and heavy fighting. Then there was Syria. And first of all, the first clue that should have hit Americans, but all these experts, is when they were predicting that the Russian army or the Russian military in Syria would run out of steam within 2 weeks to 4 weeks and then fall apart and they couldn't do their mission anymore. And yet 2-3 years later, they're still carrying out their mission every single day. That already should have sparked a lot of alarm bells in people's heads. And maybe we're underestimating things. It didn't. Don't worry about it. But what the Russian military was doing, by the way, at least on a limited basis, they were doing, particularly with fighter pilots and fighter bomber pilots, but ground assault aircraft pilots, but also with the infantry that was in there on a limited basis. But what they were actively doing was rotating people through, rotating commanders. So these guys got hands-on experience. That's to begin with. Now, the Russian army in 22 considered that the Ukrainian army, built by NATO, it was the biggest NATO army, even though it wasn't part of NATO, created and armed by NATO. And the Russian military that took it on in 22, as they were prepared to assault into Donbass, exterminate the population, and by their own documents, their plan was to hit into Volgograd, I'm sorry, not Volgograd, into Voronezh, and southeast into Rostov-on-Don to try to create a crisis in Russia and collapse the government by invading into Russia. They were preempted. There were already reconnaissance and sabotage units inside of Russia from the Ukrainians that were surrounded and exterminated. So when Russia attacked against a force that was twice as big as it was. Let's just begin with that. So there was there were a lot of casualties on the Russian side at that time because they were fighting a foe that was twice as big. Two, Russia is still fighting with one arm and one leg tied behind its back. It's still in a relatively strict terms of what it can and cannot do. You have not seen carpet bombing. Russia could turn Kiev into Gaza. Russia could turn any Ukrainian city into Gaza or into Mosul, if we want to do the American example of liberating a city, just wipe out half the population, destroy all the buildings, and put your flag on and say, liberate it. Russia isn't fighting like that. If Russia starts, and that was the message from Putin, by the way, to the Europeans. Don't think what we're doing here is what's going to happen to you. The velvet gloves are going to come off, and the steel gauntlets underneath are going to be the ones punching. So just consider that. But I don't think the Europeans really understand that. Well, some of them do. I know some people that do. I don't think that people in leadership in Europe understand that. Additionally, I mean, I'll give you this as a open secret only because it hasn't mentioned. In the first 3 months of combat operations, because negotiations were in process, the Russian army was not allowed to fire on the Ukrainians until they were fired on by the Ukrainians. So talk to guys, we're watching them getting ready for an assault, and we can't do anything. Normally, you watch somebody getting ready to assault, you're calling down artillery on their heads. You're opening fire on them. You don't wait till they attack you. Here, we had to sit there and wait until they initiated contact, and then we can start firing back. That was the first 3 months of this conflict. So the Russian military is fighting with two arms behind its back and a leg tied there too, and a hood over its head at the very beginning, and still wiped out the majority of the Ukrainian force, the First Ukrainian Army. We're on version 4.0 right now, maybe version 5.0 now. Having said that, the other reason there was a lot of casualties, higher level of casualties, is because a lot of young commanders wanted to make a name for themselves. They thought this was going to be fast. This is going to be fast over. So, you've got to show the bravery and the glory to get the glory. So they were taking risks that, one, because of lack of experience, hot-headedness, and glory hounds. They were taking risks they shouldn't have been taking. And that gets people killed. Now it's everything's quite much more sober. It's not glory. There's enough, pardon my French, there's enough shit sandwich to go around for everyone. And this is not something that's going to end soon. So, okay, Let's go steady. We go right. We don't do any stupid heroics, and just wipe out the enemy. That's what needs to be done, and that's how it's being done now. Additionally, the Russian army, what Europe fails to understand is the mobilization capability of Russia. The partial mobilization, it was very partial mobilization. So the Russian reserve, this is anybody that's had any kind of military training. I'm not talking combat experience, but any amount of military. So people have gone through the 1 year call up or served under contract or longer, but what have you. From ages of 18 to I think like 50, 55 is 30 million. About 2% was what was called up from that quantity. And of that, first and foremost, were people who were just off of contract or who had already been in combat, Syria, places like that. So they already had experience. They were still trained up, but you didn't need as much training for them. The ones that were just off contract, they were usually sent off to fill in the holes in some of these other units. The people that needed more training were sent to more training. Since then, it's primarily been not primarily. Since then, it's been volunteers. So about 30 to 40,000 volunteers a month. Some come in for patriotism, some come in for the money, whichever they come in. There are also still criminals that are being allowed in for a short list of criminal offenses. Murder's included. I'm not going to lie about it, but it's the type of murder. It's I got in a bar fight and smacked a guy with a bottle on his head, or he got hit while they were drunk and he fell, hit his head and died. That's murder in Russia. That's first-degree murder or second-degree murder. So people, for those types of offenses, they're given a chance to redeem themselves. Now these guys are getting full training because about what most people will say right off the bat. Oh well, under Prigozhin and all that, and Prigozhin was recruiting from the prisons until he was forbidden to recruit from the prisons, because what Prigozhin was doing, building up his own fame on the corpses of these guys, because he wasn't giving them training in Wagner. There's Wagner, there were professional Wagner, and then there's these guys he was pulling from prisons. They weren't getting the training, he was just using them in body weights. And then screaming, oh, I'm not getting enough shells, he got more than enough shells. He had 120% of what he needed. And as somebody that has organized military convoys, heavy vehicle convoys, the fact that he said, it took me 30 minutes, we decided to go march on first on Rostov and then on Moscow. No, it doesn't work that way. Plus, in Rostov, you saw how they went. Everybody knew their location. This was practice. So this was a mutiny that he had already planned out. And he was just building off the corpse of these conscription guys. Why I'm saying this, people are still being conscripted. Well, not conscripted. They're still being given the opportunity out of convicts coming in for mostly thieves, white-collar crimes, things like that. And they can pay off their debt to society by fighting. But they are giving full training. I've been witness to where they were giving full training. I've been on these bases where they were being trained. Before they do any kind of assaults, they're trained for up to 3 months. Before they see any kind of combat. So, and normally the way you do it too is when you get green guys in, you get them into a quiet sector to get them acclimated because they're not. It's a different mentality. It's a different atmosphere. If nobody has been around, where artillery's booming and bullets are flying over your head, you want to get them acclimated slower than just throwing them into a meat grinder. So that's one of the options, but mostly it's volunteers. Officers, interestingly enough, a lot of a lot of officers that were, my age, older, and have been out of the military. The military is not taking them back, and they're all being told your time hasn't come, which translates into there's probably going to be a big war, and then we'll take you all back when we start massing up on a large scale. So I think the military, at least from the military side, they're preparing for the big war with Europe. That they see the writing on the wall. I don't think all of Europe would go, but the Northern Europeans seem to be hell bent on their own destruction. So if they come to a fight, what are you going to do? So from that point, the Russian army's gotten much bigger and it's gotten much better. I mean, it's gotten experience. And they rotate units. So they'll have a battalion on the front or a brigade on the front for half a year. Then they rotate it back, or depending where it may be on a battalion level rotation, they rotate it back for rest organization, and they'll put the next battalion up, and so on and so on. So nobody stays on there too long. Flip it to the Ukrainian side, which, by the way, Ukraine has opened 300,000 cases of desertion. That's the Ukrainian prosecutor's office has opened 300,000 cases of. That's the French and the British Army combined. just for for comparison, 300,000 cases of desertion. The problem for the Ukrainians now, it's the veterans are deserting, because these guys have figured out there's never going to be a rotation back. The only way they leave the battlefield is either as a corpse or if they're wounded and maybe get carried out if they're lucky. Other than that, it's take your weapon and get the hell out. That's the only way off. So they're having a lot of problems, and that's the two systems. One is lost that leadership capability. The other one is building its leadership capability constantly. So you see the clash that's there. That's happening right now. Sorry for overwhelming.
No, I think what you've been talking about, it's so important because it's somehow a new, fresh, a fresh air to the whole information we have from the war in Ukraine. But when you mentioned, when we see somehow an economist being at the head of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, how that I remember when Vladimir Putin has decided to put him in that position, and everybody was talking about that this guy going to be a game changer. So far, how did you find his performance in his position, and how do you find the way that he's trying to deal with the conflict in Ukraine in terms of confronting all these Europeans? Because the war basically is an economic war. The war basically is on that front, because if you manage that, you can confront the military part. It's going to be in the hand of the commanders. But when you manage the situation, the economy part of the issue, the economy part of the conflict, then you have everything in your hand to manage. How did you find his position? I'm talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russia and his capabilities and his performance so far.
Any war that takes over more than a month, maybe 2 months, is a war of economies. Because you hit that replenishment point where you have to replenish not just men, but a lot of equipment. Some of the Europeans can't do, at least in their present state. The non-Russian Europeans. We own a third of Europe, so honestly, it's a pet peeve. Like, oh, the Europeans, yeah, we own a third of Europe. Keep going. The EU-SSR, that's the proper term. All the worst of the Soviet Union, none of the best of the Soviet Union. They learned nothing good. They just only took all the bad parts and amplified those. It's an amazing thing to watch. Belousov, first of all, to understand, Belousov is a minister of defense. He does not form military strategy. He does not form military policy as far as on what happens on the battlefield. That's not his job. Gerasimov is in charge of the actual day-to-day combat operations, so on. He's the top. Well, the top, of course, of everything is Vladimir Vladimirovich. Minister, well, by the way, Belousov, unlike Shoigu, who is also a civilian, Belousov very rarely, if ever, puts on a military uniform. He has a general's rank, but it's an honorary rank. He is strictly a civilian person. Having said that, what very few are mentioning is Belousov is a very religious man. He's very active in the church. He works as an altarman. And if you know anything about Orthodox Christians, we get very strict on a lot of things, especially if you're somebody that's working the altar as an altarman. He's going to be he's got to be very, very religious on that. And why is that important? religious people tend to be a lot less corrupt. That's just kind of how it goes. It's not to say that, if a couple gets married, the husband may not leave, but it's a lot more chance if they're just shacking up together, the guy may leave. There's a certain level of commitment. So if you got a religious man who's obviously religious, not making this for show, but has historically in his life as a religious person, he's much, much less chance of being corrupt, which means he's a straight shooter. And this is where he was brought in to straighten up the corruption that was in the different organs and get the economic policy running to support the military. And this, by the way, because 4 years in, how is 2% of the world GDP fighting off 40% of the world GDP? Well, very easy. Number one, Russia was never 2% of the world GDP. Russia was always much bigger. As somebody that I'm director of supply chain for large oil and gas services companies, I can tell you what happened early on when the Americans and the Western Europeans came into Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed, is they downgraded all of Russia's resources and industry in value. Why do you do that? And the thing is, from the Russian side, they didn't know their market value. Right after that, they had no idea. So, okay, well, these experts are telling us, okay, well, maybe that's what we're really worth. There's no real price discovery. These guys just had no idea. They were listening to their American betters because they tell us everything that we know, blah, blah, blah. And what was really probably more like 6 or 7% of GDP was dragged down as 2% of GDP. That's to begin with. And you do that because it's easier to buy things. Because if the guy thinks, he's got $100 worth of equipment and he only thinks it's worth $20, and you convince him it's not even worth 20, it's worth 15, hey, you just made a big killing on that buy. And that's how the system worked. But the problem is they convince themselves of that too. I'm talking about the Western portion. They convince themselves that Russia really is only that. Second of all, if you look realistically at economies, and look at the American economy, I will go ahead and count services into GDP, but I will cut out finance. The official finance portion of the American GDP is 21%. Unofficially, it's over 30%. So right off the bat, you take the American GDP and take a third off. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't really give you any services. It produces debt. Russia's financial sector is that big in comparison. Russia has a huge manufacturing sector. That's something else I got to ignore. Russia, just as an example, in 2025, Russia launched two different Russian companies launched two medium-range airliners into production that are 100% Russian parts. One of them was Superjet, which was being produced before, but it was being produced, a lot of the electronics and other sub-assemblies were being imported. 100% Russian manufacturing. Russia launched a new helicopter, civilian helicopter, 100% Russian manufacturing. Absolutely nothing is imported. Everything is locally mined, cut, built, produced, smelt, and 100% good. Europe can't do that. In fact, even Boeing couldn't do that and can't do it today. Boeing's biggest engineering office, their main engineering office, up to 2022 was in Moscow. Anybody doesn't believe it, look it up. Was in Moscow. They had over 700 engineers working in Moscow. Not in the US, not in the UK, but in Moscow. All of that's closed. Neither Airbus nor Boeing can build fully functional planes with just what's in the European Union or just what's produced in the US. They have to import. They have to import a lot. Russia builds Russia is literally a self-sustained economy on most things. It feeds itself quite well. By the way, it feeds about a third of the world too while we're at it. It's the biggest producer after China. It's the biggest producer of fertilizers, chemical and non-chemical fertilizer in the world, 65 million tons. Chinese, I think, are like 72. And Russia's growing at about 10% a year, 5 to 10% a year. It's the biggest exporter of fertilizer. It fed Europe with everything. That's the problem when they go, oh, well, they only gave us oil and gas. Well, no, they gave you diesel. They gave you plastics. They gave you wood products. BMW, Mercedes, and other companies were ordering steel and aluminum parts for their cars out of Russia. Paper, chemicals, base chemicals, more advanced compound chemicals, noble gases for the electronics industry, chipboards. I mean, you go down this list. And I remember with the food items. Russia was the #1 commodity and semi-assembled goods production center for all of the EU-USSR economy. They cut everything. In fact, they're about to cut their final ties, which is funny, for uranium, processed uranium for the nuclear power plants. By the way, Russia, 70% of the world's processing power for uranium. Okay, who are you going to go to? You don't have enough capacity at home. The Americans don't have capacity. Who are you going to go to? China? That's about the only other ones you can go to. Oh, the French have a good amount, but that's mostly internal use. So they cut everything off without noticing. There's the rest of the world that said, "Nah, screw off, Europe. We'll continue trade with Russia." In fact, Russia can stand up to you guys. Oh, that means we can stand up to you guys. At least, standing with Russia. Oh, and we're all sick and tired of you. So all of a sudden, the global South went, you can stay in your garden. We'll stay in the jungle. We're free, not little animals in that zoo that's called Europe. And two, Russia is a self-contained economy if it really wants to be an economy. Why did Russia sell oil and gas to Europe? To get euros to buy other things from the Europeans. If you can't get euros and you can't buy anything with euros, you don't need those euros. So you don't really need to sell anything to Europe. And once you can't buy stuff that's already developed there and you start investing in your own R&D, well, once those investments are made, you no longer need anything. Just as a quick example, I know this has nothing to do with the military, but it's the way economies are running. A friend of mine was an IT director at one of the biggest paper mills in Russia. So they would send these giant rolls of semi-raw paper to Germany, those gigantic rolls that are like 4 meters wide. And then the Germans would process that and make office paper for the printers, cardboard and all that, and export that back into Russia. Part of it went into Russia, part to other countries. Well, the Germans cut everything off, by the way, which they also cut themselves off from paper. For German newspaper stopped printing because they had no paper. The Germans even had a bit of a shortage on toilet paper. Well, what did Russia do? Well, his company spent 2 years putting together 4 manufacturing facilities for cardboard. They manufacture 80% of Russia's cardboard in these 4 facilities. And the other 20% is manufactured in a couple other companies, their competitors. Are the Germans ever going to come back to this market? Never. It's gone. The market is closed forever for the Germans. And now a lot of these Europeans are in the delusion of, well, when this is over, we'll just walk back in. Well, one, a lot of your niches are closed, either by internal Russian manufacturing, China, Iran, Brazil, whomever is also taking their place. You're not coming back. 2, most Russians are pissed off. The Europeans, they're not going to let them come back. They don't want them back. A lot of people have got to see a lot of hatred in their direction over these years. So when you're dealing with these kinds of economies, and we've got a 4-year war. Well, Europe can't manufacture. It doesn't have the raw resources. It doesn't have the raw energy. Russia does. And then behind Russia is China. China is Russia's deep rear. Russia is China's deep rear. Iran is the deep front for both, which defends, in fact, their backyards. So that's another country they cannot allow to falter, because if Iran falls, it opens up all their internal borders to penetration by the U.S. and NATO. That's basically an existential crisis for both Russia and China if something happens to Iran. You start pulling India into this orbit because the Indians suddenly realize that they're supposed to be the next wave of meat for the Americans to go fight the Chinese or something. That doesn't sound good. And all of a sudden you get the Eurasian continent, minus that little peninsula in the west that they call Europe, that you really can't beat because you're dealing with almost half the human population and the majority, realistically speaking, the majority of the world industry. Now what do you do? And that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. Stas, you mentioned the case of Iran. We know that in the Middle East, in the West Asia right now, the United States is preparing, at least what we see around Iran. They're preparing to attack Iran. They're forcing Iran into, you know, they're trying to do everything to put pressure domestically on, the economy, in terms of the exchange rate of dollar here in Iran, and they put a lot of pressure on the economy of Iran. We had the protests and riots here in Iran, manipulated by both the United States and Israel, and then we have the sort of military buildup in the region against Iran. How do you see the way that Donald Trump? We know that Donald Trump, when he came to power, when he was elected, he said the first thing, one of the first things that he has done, said that we're going to go to the Red Sea. We're going to show to the Houthis, to the Yemenis, how powerful we are. It's going to be different from what the Biden administration was doing before. And with 2 aircraft carriers, they went to the Red Sea, and they somehow decided, after some time, they decided that nothing is going well in that direction in defeating Yemenis. They withdrew from the Black Sea and the Bab el-Mandab, as they call it. Right now, they are using 1 aircraft carrier in the region, and they want to do everything. They want to attack Iran. They want to do regime change. They want to force, as Donald Trump is trying to point out, they're trying to force Iran into negotiations. But when it comes to the military part of the issue, how capable the United States, together with Israel, are to attack Iran, to destroy Iran, or somehow do whatever they want to Iran. We know they don't like the government here in Iran. They want to do regime change, from what we've seen so far. But is that sufficient? The military power they brought in the region, is that sufficient to do that?
Well, there's I think there's a second aircraft carrier group that's heading into that area too.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Well, okay, so what did the U.S. accomplish with the Houthis? We won. They're mean bastards. They're tough, but we won. What did you win? The Gerald Ford got damaged. That we know. The thing is about aircraft carriers, they're not that easy to sink, but you don't have to sink them. You just have to damage the flight deck. You damage the tarmac enough that planes can't land, planes can't take off. They're just a sitting target. There's no point in having an aircraft carrier there anymore. You steam the hell out to make sure you don't go down and become a reef. Additionally, U.S. doesn't have tender ships. So when they run out of anti-aircraft missiles or Tomahawks, we got to go somewhere to repair. With the Houthis, they went to Qatar. Well, Qatar is not going to happen because no aircraft carrier is going to come in there in a possible combat operation into the Persian Gulf. They'll be that's the end of them. There's no place for them to run and maneuver. It's too shallow, too narrow, and too easy to find. So their main game is we're going to stay out in the Indian Ocean, and they can't find us, and we're going to launch sorties. Well, of course, they're using air platforms to launch air-to-ground missiles. So they don't have to do a direct line from the aircraft carrier. They can fly in the different directions and then launch somewhere. But the problem is with it, and nobody's particularly talking about this, which is amazing to me. And they're like, oh yeah, well they have a chance because they could go run deep. How deep can they go run? They're not submarines. Now, what's above their heads? Space. What's in space? Satellites. What's the proxy war by the U.S. and the British on the Russian Black Sea Fleet? They're giving away targeting information for drones off of Russian ships from satellites. Well, you know who else can play that game? How many satellites has Russia and China got in the air? Talk about plausible deniability. I don't know where the Iranians got the exact targeting location of your aircraft carrier sitting out there for their medium-range ballistic missiles and drones. Whoops. So where are you going to run? There's no place for the American aircraft carriers to run that they cannot be seen by satellites, that the information cannot be passed. Iran sends 300-400 missiles and drones in one wave. It'll overwhelm everything that aircraft carrier group has. They run out of missiles. They can't load them fast enough in one big wave like that. Can Iran do it? I think it can do it. What would be the U.S. Reaction if an aircraft carrier goes down, sinks, or is heavily damaged? hundreds upon hundreds of casualties. There's 5,000 people on the Lincoln. 20% casualty rate. That's 1,000 people right there. Yeah, that's going to be a big explosion at home. Do you go nuclear? Well, if you go nuclear, then everything goes in a whole different direction, because neither Russia or China are going to allow Iran to go down. That opens up the Caucasus and Central Asia fully to begin with that. And both know that they're next targets for the U.S. no matter what. I mean, the U.S., at least the CIA, tried to assassinate Vladimir Vladimirovich. And whether or not Putin was in his Valdaya home, apparently his grandkids were. So, and they tried to assassinate Lukashenko's kids during that little color revolution that they started in Belarus. These people, we know what they did to Gaddafi, whose son, by the way, was murdered yesterday. Yeah. First person to show up that can solidify the country back together again. And of course, 4 gunmen took him out in his garden. Big surprise on that one. We know what we're dealing with. The people will tell you and from the looks of it, even with Vladimir Vladimirovich, they were on calls with Trump in negotiations, while the Ukrainians are launching drones with coordinates given to them by whom else? The CIA. So we know these people are willing to assassinate and murder leaders that they're in negotiations with. You can't trust them. So what was Russia and China going to do? Of course, they're going to do whatever is going to needed to defend their countries. And that means giving coordinates of an aircraft carrier to Iran so Iran can sink it. Damn right, Skippy, they're going to do that. It's in their best interest. Then there's the 56,000 Americans that are within short and medium range ballistic missiles of Iran. That's the entire Persian Gulf. That's Iraq. That's Syria, which, by the way, there's also Shia militia in those areas. There's a lot of pissed off Kurds these days in those areas that just got betrayed by the U.S. Nobody forgets this. Nobody's going to forget what the U.S. has done betraying one group after another. That's the way you make enemies with everybody in the end of the day. And there are U.S. troops all over the place. Are they targets? Absolutely. Do they become critical targets? Absolutely. All gloves are off. Israel, you got 2 Zionist entities that are hurling the world to war. And we're not even talking about if the Straits of Hormuz close. I mean, let's play the economic long game. The Straits of Hormuz close. Iran can mine them, obviously. That takes a bit of time. Or Iran can start taking out cutters and yachts and whatever and scuttling them. Straits of Hormuz are narrow. Never mind, they're overwatched by land-to-sea missiles. Missile systems all over in man-made caves and artificial in natural caves in the mountains that face the straits. So obviously it does not take that much to close those straits. 36% of the world oil comes from the Persian Gulf. No, it's not in the Russian interest either. If oil hits, I'm not saying it's going to hit 300. I think 150, 200, it'll hit easily. It's not in the Russian interest either, because guess what happens when oil hits 200 or 150? The world economy goes down. And whether, Russia's selling oil cheap to China, but China is going to get hit too, because China also has a manufacturing base on export. Everybody takes a hit. So it's not in their interest. But what happens to the rest of the world? Russia has enough oil. The U.S. actually has enough oil. It may have to cut down, but the U.S. is going to get hit by high rising prices. The only option is if Trump declares an emergency and either nationalizes the oil companies or steps in and forces a maximum ceiling on them. Okay, so the U.S. is more or less still taken care of. It's still going to suffer. Prices are still going to increase, particularly because they have to import things, and they're still going to be hit by oil prices. But then you get Europe. Because what's going to happen is we're not just dealing with increases of prices. This is not a price shock. This is a supply side shock. There literally will not oil and oil supply and demand are very, very closely aligned. A little up, a little down, a little up, a little down. Not huge differences. And all of a sudden you take 40% or 35% of the world's oil off the market. It's gone. Guess what happens? You put this out 3-4 months, there will be European countries and African countries and other countries that will literally run out of oil. Everything stops. The modern economy goes kaput. No oil, no diesel, no petrol, Now what do you do? Now what do you really do? Total economic collapse for the European Union. Absolutely, economic collapse. They've cut themselves off of everybody but the Americans for the most part, with Qatar and a few others. Hey, yeah, oh yeah, Qatar can't export either. So now what do you do? And if they're not thinking this through, but they're all cheerleading Trump, if they're not thinking this through, and I doubt it they are, because most of these people are not mentally capable to think things through. I mean, Mertz has started talking about maybe blowing up the last nuclear power plants was a bad idea. The last one was demolished on his term, a couple months ago. And I was like, oh, maybe that was a bad idea. Well, why didn't you stop it? These people are not farsighted. So they're backing Trump. Can Trump damage Iran? Yes, of course he can. But the delivery systems are very out of whack. U.S. is using the main U.S. missile is the Tomahawk. It's carrying, about 200, 300-pound warhead, or kilo, actually, warhead. I should look that up, the exact weight of the warhead. But if Nigeria is anything to go by, out of the 12 Tomahawks that were fired in Nigeria, 4 warheads didn't explode. They've been found, they've been identified, they've been photographed. 4 warheads, a 33% failure rate. Maybe it was just a bad batch. Maybe they're just old missiles. Maybe they were never that reliable to begin with in reality. But if you're looking at 33% failure rate, you already got big issues. Failure to explode, that's kind of it's not enough to get there. You kind of have to explode on target. If you're missing that last little bit of a component, well, okay, you might have a hole in your roof, but you're not having a destroyed building or facility. So you got problems. That's one. And the payload, the Israelis are shooting also. The payloads are small for the rest of the missiles. You're talking about air-to-air missiles from fighter planes, from fighter bombers. You're not talking carpet bombing, because anything that comes in there now is not going to survive for a carpet bombing run. So you're talking relatively small warheads. Your medium-range ballistic missile is delivering basically a 1-ton warhead on target. You're talking, a much larger kaboom. And when there's dozens of them, if not hundreds of them, exploding in a city, and the Israelis put their anti-aircraft systems inside their cities, just like the Ukrainians do, by the way. Just even to take out the anti-aircraft systems, you're doing massive damage to everything around you, around it anyways. So the damage vis-a-vis the Americans and the Israelis is going to be many times worse. Plus, you're dealing with a compact country that, it's hard to miss something. You got to really try to miss a facility because everything's compact together. Iran is a country that's much, much larger. Things are spread out. And now that the 12-day war is over, Iran has signed, which it did on the second day, because everyone's like, oh, Russia betrayed Iran. No, Russia never betrayed Iran. The liberals, unfortunately, as we know, didn't want to. Russia was proposing a strict military alliance on the level of North Korea. Instead, it got a watered-down statement about mutual efforts against regional threats, whatever the hell that means. That means nothing. And then Iran actually signed the document a day after the 12-day war started. That the beheading attempt began. Well, Russia had already signed everything. Things have changed. Russian S-300s are in. Russian S-400s are in. Russia has sent into Iran Su-35s. Iranian pilots have been trained, and more are being trained on the Su-35s. The Chinese are bringing in heavy equipment. All sides are bringing in jamming equipment, as we saw that the whole revolution collapsed as soon as the Starlink terminals were A, jammed, and B, were located, and the people could be scooped up along with their terminals. We're dealing with a whole different level of capacity here, and they can't pull off the kind of beheading that the Israelis did previously, that Trump was counting on. You can only kind of do that once, unless you're dealing with a total idiot that doesn't learn from the first mistake. Iran is not a total idiot. It learned quite well. It's not going to get repeated. So now what do you do? So no, I don't think they have any capacity, unless they go nuclear, which is a whole different ballpark in that case. They don't have a capacity to destroy Iran. They have a capacity to damage Iran, of course, but they can't destroy Iran. Their only hope is to try to destroy Iran from within, with these different revolutionary groups, and Azerbaijan and Armenia sitting now basically American and Israeli proxies. I mean, there's an American base in Azerbaijan. There's an Israeli base in Azerbaijan, and we know that as a fact. And the latest drones that were flying in on the Caspian that hit Russian tankers were flying obviously from Azerbaijan. So very limited amount of countries on the Caspian Sea. So it's definitely not from Russia or Iran or from Iran. So that leaves only Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. So it was flying in from, and the witnesses saw them flying in from Azerbaijan. So those areas have to be dealt with sooner than later. But the fact is outside, in my view, outside of an internal explosion inside Iran, society-wise, there's absolutely no chance of, short of going nuclear weapons, there's absolutely no chance of the U.S. being able to destroy Iran.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stas, for being with us today. No, great pleasure to have you on, and it was amazing to hear your point of view and the sort of information that you have provided us with. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure.